Hi, everybody. You're listening to Comics and History, episode number 119, part 2 Spotlight on the Spectre in the Golden Age continued. And welcome to the show. I am your host, Brian J. Rygate, and class is back in session as we continue our look at the Spectre during the Golden Age of comics. Now, if you have not listened to part 1 of this episode, you need to put this episode on pause and go back and listen to part 1, because in part 1, I spoke about the Spectre's origin story that was told in the pages of More Fun Comics issues 52 through 54. And I'm going to start off the second part of the episode by talking about certain precedents that were set in the story by the Spectre's co-creators Jerry Siegel and Bernard Bailey. And when I say precedents, I mean certain concepts which were established in this three-part origin story that really set the model for the Spectre going forward. Certainly, there were certain things in this story, as well as in later Golden Age Spectre stories, which were open to speculation, which would lead other artists and writers to consider the exact nature of the relationship between Jim Corrigan and the Spectre, or between the Spectre and the host. But certain key things were introduced in this origin story that have remained consistent throughout the Spectre's publishing history. First off, I want to note that in issue 53 of More Fun Comics, when we see the Spectre donning his costume, it was originally blue and white, not the familiar green and white. And in most reprintings of the story, the coloring has been redone such that when Jim puts on the Spectre costume for the first time, it's the familiar green and white. And now I find that I prefer the green and white look. It creates an interesting look for the Spectre. It certainly makes the Spectre appear more ominous. And certainly in the beginning of comic books, the idea was that the heroes wore the primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, and the villains tended to wear the secondary and tertiary colors. And so it's interesting here to see a character like the Spectre who is on the side of the angels, but is delivering a very different form, a very brutal form of punishment upon his enemies. And so I think for that reason, that's why a decision was made to subsequently show the Spectre wearing green and white. I'm thinking another reason is that within Christian mythology, color blue is associated with the Virgin Mary. And who knows, perhaps there was some concern between Siegel and Bailey and the editors that people might look at the Spectre wearing blue and white and say, we don't feel comfortable with this. And so maybe that's why the Spectre's colors were changed to green and to white. And certainly given the relationship between the Spectre and the Green Lantern side of the DC Universe in later decades, it's especially fitting that the Spectre would be wearing green and white. And of course, I've referred to it as a costume here. I want to say that this is the only time where the Spectre's guise is shown as like a costume, as something which Jim Corrigan would put on. Going forward, there were no shirt rips. There were no scenes where Corrigan had to change out of his civilian gear and put on what was essentially a complete bodysuit. Rather, going forward, the stories show Jim simply switching to the Spectre, or transforming to the Spectre, very much like in later decades when different Green Lanterns could simply morph their costume into being. And then, of course, during the John Ostrander and Tom Mandrake run, it was established that the Spectre was actually a separate identity, and so when the host took on the form of the Spectre, they took on that green and white look. But certainly, the costume as created by Bailey and Siegel was one precedent, something which stayed consistent throughout Jim Corrigan's time as the Spectre. And then there would be changes in the Spectre's look when Hal Jordan and Crispus Allen became the Spectre. But more on that in future Spotlight episodes. So in terms of certain concepts which were established in this origin story that stayed throughout the entire run of the Spectre's publishing history, going even into the present day, there's the voice, or the presence, as this character is referred to. And there are a lot of fans and historians say, well, it's God. It's the voice of God. But Jerry Siegel was Jewish. I'm not sure about Bernard Bailey. And certainly Jewish writers and artists were working in the Golden Age under the knowledge that the majority of the comics readers were presumably Christian. And so you didn't see characters who were explicitly or overtly Jewish. But at the same time, looking at Superman, I know that beginning with the original Richard Donner Superman movie, there's been a lot of connotations, references made to Superman as a Christ-like figure, and Jor-El being like God. But that's not something which Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster came up with. There are those historians who argue that Siegel and Shuster's Superman was based more upon Moses, but even in those original Superman stories, readers couldn't tell outright what Superman's religious background was. In later years, it was assumed he was Christian because there were all of those Christmas stories published in Superman Action and various DC comics and throughout the merchandise and so on and so forth. Certainly when we get to the Ostrander Mandrake run, it becomes pretty clear that the voice is the voice of God. But outside of that, there's no real way to say that the voice is a particular God from any religious denomination. It's simply a disembodied voice that has the power to imbue these great powers upon Jim Corrigan and others. During the New 52, the voice actually appeared in the Spectre comics and was referred to there as the presence, and in a sign of the presence's interesting sense of humor, the presence took the form of a Scottish Terrier dog. But outside of that, the voice has always been just that, a voice. There's been no face, nothing physical about the character. And certainly the voice, or the presence if you prefer, has played an important role in a number of Spectre stories over the decades. The concept of Jim wanting his eternal rest is something which ran throughout his entire publishing history, going right through the end of the Ostrander Mandrake run. And it's something which comes up here in the origin, where we see that now that he's dead, Jim has this natural want to go to the heavens, and he wants to have his eternal slumber, but he's denied that. And that comes up in the very first Michael Fleischer and Jim Aparo Spectre story from the 1970s, Jim wanting to end his existence on Earth and to go to his eternal rest is something which is a major component of the Ostrander Mandrake run. So here we get it right in the origin story. The concept of the Spectre being able to split in two is an interesting precedent which is set here. Now here it's something very simple. Jim is able to create a duplicate of himself, and that duplicate, being invisible, is able to go into certain areas and perform different investigative tasks that Jim normally couldn't. And here it's established that this is simply a duplicate. This is not really a separate entity. But the idea of Jim being able to split in two, one part being in human form or in human guise, and the other being in the guise of the Spectre, is something which would run in later Spectre stories from the Golden Age, specifically Morphin Comics number 90, but it was also something which came up during the Doug Monk or Doug Mensch run of the Spectre in the Copper Age. Again, referring to Ostrander and Mandrake in their run, Jim Corrigan and the Spectre were one entity, but they were still able to have this back and forth discussion with each other. And going into the Hal Jordan and Crispus Allen eras of the Spectre, there were points where we could see Hal gain a measure of separation from the Spectre, even though Hal, as he appeared, was really a piece of the Spectre's endoplasmic being. At the start of his run, Crispus and the Spectre were separate and had to reach that decision to unite and become one. It's been an interesting back and forth over the nature of Jim Corrigan and the Spectre. Were they two entities? Were they one? Were they two entities bound together eternally? Were they two entities which could separate for a short period of time or a long period of time? It's just interesting how that question was raised right in the beginning of the Spectre's run. Certainly one of the more appealing concepts behind the Spectre stories has been how the Spectre doles out punishment to the guilty. The Spectre isn't there so much to render judgment, rather the Spectre is there to punish the guilty and prepare them for their final judgment by the voice. But certainly it's a very cruel form of punishment, and that became especially clear. It was there in these early Spectre stories, because early Golden Age stories tended to show some very brutal forms of violence, but especially during the Fleischer-Aparo run on the Spectre, when the Spectre would turn himself or itself into a giant pair of scissors and cut the guilty person in two, or make the person decay, age rapidly until they became just a pile of bones, or turning a villain such as Dr. Light into a candle and then blowing out the candle. That's something which has appealed to a lot of readers who say, well, Superman, he goes in there, he saves the day, but he saves the punches for, robots or characters that are on the same power level of his, and otherwise, he tries to avoid using violence in confrontations. Batman, inspires fear in criminals. He threatens them, but he certainly doesn't kill them. But the Spectre really stands out. Certainly, I'd say several steps ahead of even Hawkman in terms of how cruel he is in punishing the villains. And